Thanks very much. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal and Wangan people of the Eora Nation, the First Nations people whose land we tread on. We pay respect to the elders past and present and all Indigenous people here. We acknowledge the injustices done in our name and we will speak out, always. We acknowledge that it is and always will be Aboriginal land. My name's Wynter. I'm a member of Socialist Alliance. And I'm honoured to be asked to speak here with the Candlelight Alliance. My working life has been as a research biochemist. I have worked with radioactivity in the lab, so I know what is at stake with radioactive effects on the human body, and I have also worked at the Workers' Health Centre in Queensland, and I was advising someone who came into the hospital, a New Zealander who'd been exposed to radioactivity on the Montebello Islands. So I've been also working on cancer genetics, and so that was some of my experiences, and you can see what's been happening with any exposure to radioactivity. The Japanese government will at present allow TEPCO to release 1.3 million tonnes of radioactive waste into the Pacific Ocean over the next 30 years. This is a crime against humanity. It's absolutely outrageous, and words cannot describe the enormity of this crime. We must be all aware of that. We don't know what radioisotopes are in that waste. Someone mentioned 65 radionucleotides. There's tritiated water, which will affect all our food and all the fish in the ocean. There's strontium-90, which can be easily incorporated into our bodies to replace calcium. And there's also iodine-125, which will also affect our thymus glands. And it's impossible to find the list of radioisotopes that are present, and it's impossible to find how much of the radioactivity is present in the wastewater they're going to release. There are serious global ramifications of this action, and it will directly affect all the peoples of the Pacific, especially Korea, because that will be where the most concentrated releases will occur, and in 3 years it will spread all around the Pacific, including Australia, New Zealand, and all the Pacific Islands and Kiribati. It's just an outrageous act of the Japanese government. South Korea and Pacific Islands will be in the forefront of this release of radioactive waste. We need to remind Japan and other nuclear states of our nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement slogan, which says, if it is safe, dump it in Tokyo, test it in Paris, store it in Washington, but keep it out of the Pacific nuclear. Yeah, store it in Washington. They're one of the sources of this problem. And I didn't know until recently, but uranium supplied Australia supplied the uranium to the TEPCO Fukushima reactor from the Ranger and Olympic Dam mines in South Australia. When those reactors fired and melt down and the explosions in March 2011. The Australasian Nuclear Free Alliance statement said the Australian government and the mining corporations BHP and Rio Tinto are partly responsible for the death and destruction resulting from that Fukushima disaster. They knew about the corruption in Japan's nuclear industry, but they just kept supplying uranium to it because of the dollar, as we've heard in the great songs that we've heard from a cappella. The Australian government has a responsibility to stand with all the local communities around the Pacific, as well as in Japan, Korea, China and Pacific Islands, in calling on the Japanese government not to dump radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. We must support Pacific people's fundamental right to their sovereignty and self-determination against Japan's nuclear colonisation. If Japan is to go ahead with the dumping of radioactive waste, Australia should play a leading role in taking a case to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea against Japan. No official statement has been made by Anthony Albanese and the federal government. And we don't expect much from them either, because it conflicts with the signing of the Quad partnership. And that's another problem, and that's another problem for Australia to deal with this issue, is the signing of the Australian government with the Quad agreement, which means they will allow nuclear submarines into the country. We must remember the tragic anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and highlight the Pacific Islands, their nuclear history that followed on those events. There's been irreparable damages on the people and environment from 318 nuclear weapons tests undertaken by the United States, United Kingdom and France. In the last 3/4 of a century, in the last 75 years since Hiroshima, there have been 2,000 nuclear tests have been carried out in the Pacific. The Marshall Islands, French Polynesia, Australia, New Zealand and Kiribati have not been effectively remedied or addressed by the nuclear-armed nations of the United States, France and the United Kingdom. We have a real struggle ahead of us, I think, to educate the Australian people what is happening and how it will cause the suffering of all people in the Pacific Rim, especially the Korean people who will have to deal with this problem first. Nobody knows about it here. There's been no response by the media in this country. People just don't know this is happening. I only learned about it recently. We really have to carry out a grassroots organisation of all people around the Pacific, including New Zealanders and the islanders who live in Sydney and Australia, to know about this issue and start organising against it. We will all end up suffering from cancers of one sort or another when you're exposed to these radioactive nucleotides in the water, and there is no way to prove it in a court of law that the exposure to these radionucleotides caused your cancer. There isn't a way you can prove it. So you can't take a case of suing the companies involved and the Australian government for what has happened. We have to join together to stop it now. And we have to make the Australian government take responsibility for past crimes of supplying uranium to Fukushima and the nuclear reactor. So Japan, stop the release of radioactive water into the Pacific and store it on the land. And I'll just add and emphasise that we should get the Australian government to take a case to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea against Japan. Thanks very much for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Dr. Coral. It was very powerful. And for 잠시 한국말